This is Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft and Amy Jacobson on AM 560. The Answer.
Good morning, Dan and Amy. And as it pertains to the Russian collusion investigation and where it may go and what, if any, limits there are on it, Rod Rosenstein, the deputy AG and the acting overseer as it pertains to that investigation and Bob Mueller, the special counsel's work, was on with Chris Wallace on yesterday. And he had this to say about a much discussed topic recently, the scope of Mueller's investigation and whether it is limited in any substantial way.
Chris, the special counsel is subject to the rules and regulations of the Department of Justice, and we don't engage in fishing expeditions. Now, that order that you read, that doesn't detail specifically who may be the subject of the investigation, right, because we don't reveal that publicly. But Bob Mueller understands, and I understand, the specific scope of the investigation, and so, no, it's not a fishing expedition.
I understand it's not a fishing expedition, but you say any matters that arose or may arise directly from the investigation. In the course of his investigation of the issues that he is looking at, if he finds evidence of a crime, can he look at that?
Well, Chris, if he finds evidence of a crime that's within the scope of what Director Mueller and I have agreed is the appropriate scope of his investigation, then he can. If it's something outside that scope, he needs to come to the acting attorney general, at this time me, for permission to expand his investigation. But we don't talk about that publicly, and so the speculation you've seen in the news media, that's not anything that I've said. It's not anything Director Mueller said. We don't know who's saying it or how credible those sources are.
Right, and Rosenstein went on to say, with respect to the comparisons that are made to Ken Starr starting out investigating the Clintons over land deals and winding up with a prosecution for lying under oath as a result of the Lewinsky affair. He makes the point, Starr had to go back and get authorization to pursue that lying under oath and the Lewinsky affair off-ramp that he discovered during the course of his investigation. So does that satisfy us in terms of legitimate parameters for the investigation as well as oversight and thus potential restraint from DOJ on Mueller? Well, why don't we get an expert opinion on that? And we happen to have one. He is Andy McCarthy, former U.S. attorney and now a contributing editor over at National Review, where he writes on these topics in great detail and with great insight. Andy, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Dan. Amy, how are you?
Great. So what about Rosenstein's comments about the boundaries for Mueller? Does that satisfy any concerns you have about so-called fishing expeditions?
No, look, it's amazing to listen to Rosenstein talk about how Mueller has to follow the rules and regulations of the Justice Department, when the problem we have is because Rosenstein didn't follow the rules and regulations. You are supposed to have a basis for a criminal investigation before you appoint the special counsel. You're not supposed to appoint a special counsel for something that's not a criminal investigation, which is what Rosenstein did, and then turn him loose to try to find crimes that are related to that investigation. So the problem isn't that the problem isn't whether Mueller needs to come back to get any original jurisdiction. The problem is that Rosenstein didn't fix his jurisdiction in a concrete manner consistent with the regulations in the first place. So my quarrel with this continues to be that you're supposed to have the criminal investigation basis first, and then you appoint the special counsel. You don't appoint a special counsel and tell them, go on ahead and see if you can find a criminal basis for something.
So it seems a little bit like a witch hunt.
Well, witch hunt is Trump's term. It's not mine. I mean, witch hunt says something to me about Mueller's motivation that I don't think there's evidence for. The fact that I think that this has been set up in a really screwed up manner doesn't mean that I think that Mueller is so determined to make a case against Trump that he'll do everything possible to do that. I could turn out to be wrong about that. It may turn out to be more like a witch hunt. But I prefer fishing expedition. I know we're quarreling over terms, but I think he's been unleashed with no real boundaries on his jurisdiction. And I didn't hear anything Rosenstein said yesterday that changes that.
Oh, well, witch hunt is a term that Alan Dershowitz, liberal con law professor, formerly of Harvard Law, has also used with respect to this, just because every time you ask a pertinent question to the party that would know, you get an answer that's exculpatory, at least as it pertains to the president. Rosenstein was asked by Wallace yesterday about has the president directed you to investigate any individual specifically, because of his rhetoric on the campaign trail about they should be looking at Hillary's deleted emails. And Rosenstein said, no, he hasn't. It wouldn't be appropriate. We don't operate that way. No, he hasn't. We had Comey and McCabe testifying in the Hill. Has the president or anybody else tried to obstruct your investigation? No, they haven't. So, there may be something with Flynn and how he conducted his private business. There may be something with Manafort and how he conducted his private business. But there just is no shred of evidence to support any of the wild assertions being made by Democrats, including those in the D.C. press corps. And yet the narrative pushes on because he impaneled the grand jury last week, did Mueller. Now we have, is Trump on his way to impeachment? And we're going to have that question batted about for the next week or month.
Well, it's natural that should happen. I mean, I wrote myself over the weekend about the fact that a grand jury is not just reduced to deciding whether to bring or not bring charges proposed by a prosecutor. There's a provision in federal law that allows a grand jury to write a report. And in certain circumstances, they're allowed to do that. And they can lay out in a report anything that they think is misconduct by a public official that doesn't necessarily rise to the level of criminality. And they can lard it with everything that they found about the guy's background that may or may not have anything to do with the ostensible reason for this investigation, which is Russian interference in the election and Trump collusion in it. And, of course, as I've pointed out a number of times, impeachment doesn't require an indictable offense. What it really is in the nature of is like the military concept of conduct unbecoming or dereliction of duty. It really goes to this question of whether somebody is fit to wield power or not. Now, understand, I am not proposing that they should do this, but if I were representing Trump, I'd want to know, how bad could this get, or where could this all go?
Yeah.
And they could easily have a grand jury report that gets submitted to Congress and becomes the basis for impeachment proceedings, particularly if the Democrats advance in the 2018 midterms. I think we ought to have our eyes open that that's where this could be headed.
Does it give you great pause knowing that this grand jury was convened in Washington, D.C., where 94% of the people voted for Hillary Clinton?
It does. I don't really worry about that kind of stuff, Amy, because first of all, it's the president and it's it's political Washington, so the venue of Washington is likely to be appropriate. Secondly, a grand jury is not like a petit jury. You only need to get a majority of 23 people to file charges. And third, if ultimately charges did get filed, I don't expect that to happen. But if it did happen, all those things could be challenged at that point. You could challenge the composition of the grand jury. You could challenge whether venue was proper there. I'm much more concerned about the lack of parameters on the investigation than I am concerned about where the investigation takes place, because if there's misconduct here that is unsavory enough that it rises to the level of something you might consider filing charges about, that would be a problem whether it was in Washington or Iowa or Houston or any place else.
Well, and that speaks to this question that we have to remember to ask: who investigates the investigators? And it's not just with respect to the parameters of Mueller's investigation. There's also the story out from Friday. DOJ released 413 pages of emails related to the private meeting between former President Bill Clinton and then Attorney General Loretta Lynch during the FBI's investigation into Hillary Clinton's Benghazi emails. The FBI, this is, by the way, as a result of a lawsuit filed against the DOJ by ACLJ, which is where Jay Sekulow and his son Jordan are otherwise housed when Jay is not representing the president. The FBI had earlier said such records, 413 pages of emails, did not exist. So Jordan Sekulow said on Friday that the Comey FBI lied to us. What about accountability there?
Well, obviously, it's something that ought to be looked into. The problem is that when you ask who investigates the investigators and then you press on questions like this, the answer to that question is Congress. And I didn't detect through the Obama years when the Republicans had a congressional majority that there was much appetite for oversight of this kind.
Yeah.
And I'm not detecting a lot of appetite for it right now. But that's, I mean, basically the judiciary is doing its part because even though you get these disclaimers like you just mentioned from the FBI, these litigations under FOIA roll on, and it's not just Jay Sekulow's group. I think Judicial Watch also has a bunch of suits as well. So the judiciary, it seems to me, is doing its part. It's forcing the government to comply and to put out this information. I'd also note that a lot of the documents that you just talked about were released with major redactions.
Yeah. And
frankly, I must say the redactions don't make any sense to me, the basis for them. I don't know why, this whole idea that the FBI and the Justice Department prepare talking points about Lynch's conversation with Clinton, which are supposed to be prepared for the purpose of press consumption, right? And now they won't tell us what they were because they say it's deliberative process. I mean, that's preposterous. So, they need to go back to the court and get those redactions removed as well. But the point is that we have to rely on these other branches of government to do their work. I think the courts are doing a good job, but Congress seems somnolent to me.
Yeah, and the lawlessness of law enforcement agencies is sort of a threat to liberty, I'd say.
Well, look, power can always be abused, no matter who has it, and whenever it is abused, and the institutions that are in place to check it don't do their jobs, then it's a threat to liberty. People don't realize that the genius of the Constitution, the genius of the framers, is this whole idea not only of separation of power, but incentivizing the different branches to check each other.
Yeah.
And when one fails to do that, that means another branch accumulates more power, and the framers understood that the more power you accumulate, the closer to tyranny you are.
He is Andy McCarthy, former Chief Assistant U.S. Attorney in Manhattan, now contributing editor at National Review. Andy, thanks as always for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me. Take care.
And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
If you're